Don't embarrass me, Chloe. Elliot's dad is a federal judge. He holds real power, not like those grease-stained enlisted grunts in your cheap Navy ship belly. Right in the middle of the Palm Beach elite, my older sister dragged me in front of her future in-laws, slapping on a commercial smile. Everyone meet my little sister. She does paperwork, like a low-level clerk in the Navy. Boring, but at least the government feeds her. A few mocking chuckles rippled through the room. But directly across from us, Elliot's dad, the powerful federal judge, suddenly froze. The champagne flute in his hand tipped. His eyes went wide with absolute shock. Dead silence hit the room as he suddenly stood at rigid attention, snapped his heels together, and respectfully extended his hand to me. "Ma'am, it is an absolute honor to see you again." Before I tell you exactly how their masks shattered into a million pieces, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been trampled by your own family just to feed their ridiculous egos. The mocking chuckles faded into the background noise of clinking crystal glasses and smooth, lifeless jazz. I did not flinch. I just stood there, back straight, shoulders locked, a perfect rigid parade rest right in the middle of a room that smelled like old money, stale arrogance, and cheap intentions. Talia stood next to me, practically suffocating me with a heavy, sweet floral perfume that cost more than a car payment. She wore a tailored silk gown that probably maxed out her third credit card of the year. I wore a gray, shapeless bargain bin dress she threw at my face exactly 2 hours ago. Pinned to my chest was a flimsy white plastic name tag. Chloe Carter, administrative clerk. I did not look at the crowd. I did not care about the rich housewives whispering behind their manicured hands. My eyes snapped to the right, exactly 6 feet away, Raymond and Vivian Carter. My parents. They were standing right there in the open. I watched my father's chest rise and fall beneath his rented tuxedo. He was breathing perfectly fine. His heart rate was not spiking. He heard every single word Talia just spit out. He heard his oldest daughter strip away my rank, my honor, and my 13 years of brutal military service, reducing me to a pathetic punchline just to get a laugh out of a room full of strangers. Did he step in? Did he clear his throat and tell the truth? No. He took a slow sip of his top-shelf bourbon. Then he offered a stiff, awkward nod to the crowd. He was playing along, backing up the lie to suck up to the Reynolds family, selling out his own flesh and blood for a temporary seat at a country club table. My jaw clamped shut so hard my teeth ached. A bitter metallic taste flooded my mouth. "Watch your back, miss." A waiter carrying a heavy silver tray of empty oyster shells shoved past me. His elbow clipped my shoulder hard. The cheap plastic name tag snapped off the fabric of my dress and clattered onto the cold Italian marble floor. The waiter did not even look back. He just kept walking. I crouched down. My fingers brushed the freezing stone. I picked up the piece of plastic. As I stood back up, my right thumb instinctively ran over the jagged edge of the pin. The skin there was thick, dead. A heavy yellowish callus built from years of dragging the steel slide and pulling the trigger of a service pistol. I stared at the word clerk. For a split second, the classical music in the room completely drowned out. I heard the deafening, bone-rattling roar of a Navy destroyer's engine room. I tasted the dry, chalky grit of old combat rations stuck in the back of my throat. I felt the suffocating 110-degree heat of a concrete bunker in the Middle East pressing down on my lungs. 13 years. I traded my youth for blood money. I hoarded every single cent of my hazard pay. I lived like a ghost, dumping my paychecks straight into index funds while I slept on hard steel racks with one eye open. And Talia. She spent her 20s drowning in bank overdraft fees, buying $500 shoes to impress people who would not spit on her if she were on fire. Yet here I was, the grunt, the embarrassment, the stain on the family portrait. I squeezed the plastic badge in my fist. The sharp metal pin dug deep into my palm. It did not hurt. You cannot hurt a nerve that is already dead. The party finally started to thin out. Guests drifted toward the outdoor terrace to smoke cigars and talk about golf. I turned toward the exit. I was done playing the prop. Before I could take 3 steps, a hand clamped down hard on my bicep. Sharp acrylic nails dug violently into my skin. Not so fast. Vivian, my mother. She yanked me out of the main room and into a dimly lit, narrow hallway near the coat check, out of sight from the people who actually mattered to her. She reached up and aggressively tugged at my collar, trying to straighten a wrinkle that was not even there. Her breath smelled of gin and fake peppermint. "Do not give me that look, Chloe," she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "Talia is marrying into real money tomorrow. The Reynolds family practically owns half this coast." I stared at her, blank, cold, just analyzing a threat. "You just need to be the backdrop for your sister tonight." She kept going, her eyes darting around the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "It is just a title. It is superficial stuff. Swallow your damn pride and take it. You owe her this. I owe her this." The words hung heavily in the stale air. 13 years of absolute radio silence. 13 years of zero phone calls. Zero letters while I was deployed in combat zones. But tonight I owed them my dignity so they could play pretend. She reached out, holding the plastic tag, ready to pin it back onto my chest like a brand. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not waste a single breath trying to explain my worth to a woman who only saw me as a pawn. I just raised my left hand and swatted her arm away. Hard. Vivian gasped, stumbling back half a step, hitting the wall. Her eyes widened, completely shocked that the quiet little workhorse just bucked. I did not say a single word. I just turned my back on her and walked away. A silent execution. I headed straight down the corridor for the grand foyer. I needed air. I needed to get the hell out of this zip code before I did something that would require a cleanup crew. The front reception desk was completely empty. The host had abandoned his station to help bus tables in the back. I walked past the heavy mahogany wood. But out of the corner of my eye, something caught my attention. A thick, leather-bound guest book. It was sitting wide open under a small brass reading lamp. The master VIP list for tomorrow's main wedding event. I stopped, my boots planted firm on the expensive Persian rug. I looked down at the crisp ivory paper, black ink, bold letters, right at the very top of table number 1. Federal Judge Stephen Reynolds. I stared at the name. The ink seemed to burn right through the page. Stephen Reynolds, Miami. 10 years ago, the highly classified military tribunal. The man whose entire career and life I saved with a single stroke of my pen. In my head, a heavy mechanical click echoed loudly in the silence, like the safety lock snapping off a loaded sniper rifle. My parents thought they had me cornered. Talia thought she had buried me alive. They thought they owned the narrative, controlling the board like a cheap game of checkers. I looked up from the book. I stared at my own reflection in the dark glass of the front double doors. I did not cry. I did not break down. A slow, razor-thin smile stretched across my face. It was cold. It was dead. They had no idea who they just invited into their house. They handed me the shovel, and tomorrow they were going to dig their own graves. The name burned on the page. Stephen Reynolds. The safety lock in my brain snapped off. The smooth jazz music, the smell of expensive perfume, the hollow chatter of the Palm Beach Country Club. It all faded into dead static. Suddenly, I was not 32 anymore. I was 19. Breathing the damp, bone-chilling air of Portland, Oregon. 13 years ago. The old house. The dining room floorboard squeaked under a cheap-stained rug. The smell of burnt meatloaf, stale beer, and instant mashed potatoes hung heavy in the air. The American middle-class dream on a tight budget. Dad sat at the head of the table. He did not look at me. He looked at Talia. She was 22, blonde, fresh out of an overpriced liberal arts college with a useless degree paid for by a second mortgage. "You have the looks, Tally," Dad said, pointing his fork at her. He chewed with his mouth half open. "You are going to marry well. You belong in high society." Then he shifted his eyes to me. The warmth vanished instantly. He looked at me like I was a bad investment, a rusted-out car taking up space in his driveway. "You," he grunted, swallowing hard. "You are too stiff, too rough around the edges. No charm. Do the military thing. Hide in a cubicle, push paper, collect a safe government check. Just stay out of the way." I did not argue. I kept my back perfectly straight against the hard wooden chair. I cut a piece of dry meat, put it in my mouth, chewed. The food tasted like sawdust. I forced it down, swallowing the massive lump of humiliation blocking my throat. Fast forward a few months. The night I got my O3 promotion, Navy Lieutenant. I spent 2 hours standing in the cramped, humid laundry room. The single overhead bulb buzzed like an angry hornet. The smell of a hot iron and heavy liquid starch filled the air, sticking to the back of my throat. I pressed my service dress white uniform until the creases were sharp enough to draw blood. I put it on. The fabric was heavy, crisp. It meant something. I had survived the screaming, the mud, the tearing down of my muscles. I earned this. I walked into the living room. Mom was slumped on the couch, a plastic cup of cheap boxed wine in her hand. A trashy reality TV show blared on the screen, casting a blue light across her tired face. I stood there, feet shoulder-width apart, waiting, just hoping for a nod. A smile, a hand reaching out to touch my shoulder. She squinted, not at my rank pins, not at my face. "Move, Chloe," she snapped. Her voice was raspy from cheap cigarettes. "That white shirt is glaring on the TV screen. It hurts my eyes." She waved her hand dismissively, like I was a stray dog blocking her view. Talia walked in from the kitchen holding a diet soda. She stopped. Her eyes raked up and down my uniform. A slow, disgusted sneer curled her lips. "You look pathetic," she hissed. Her voice was venom pure and unfiltered, wearing that stiff, cheap fabric like it actually means something. "You make this family look desperate, Chloe. You are never going to sit at the same table as people with real influence. You are just the help." I looked at my mother. She took another sip of her wine. She did not defend me. I looked at my father in his recliner. He turned the page of his newspaper. Silence. Their silence was the judge, jury, and executioner. It was a life sentence. I was the scapegoat. Talia was the golden calf. I did not scream. I turned around and walked back to my room. I took off the service dress whites. I did not hang them up. I folded them. Sharp, tight, perfect squares. Every movement was mechanical. Dead. 3 in the morning. The house was dead quiet. The damp Portland cold seeped through the cracked window, freezing the condensation on the glass. I pulled out a heavy green Marine Corps duffel bag. I shoved the uniform inside, added 3 pairs of socks, 2 shirts, my boots. I sat on the edge of my bare mattress. The room was dark. The shadows felt heavier than usual. I realized then that blood does not make a family. Blood is just an accident of biology. If you have ever felt completely invisible in your own home, if you have ever had your biggest achievements completely ignored by the people who were supposed to love you the most, do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment the word invisible down below. Let me know I am not the only one who had to pack their bags in the dark. I zipped the duffel bag. The heavy brass teeth grinding together sounded like a vault locking shut. I did not write a goodbye note. They did not deserve my handwriting. I threw the heavy bag over my shoulder. The rough canvas dug hard into my collarbone. I walked out the front door. The rusty hinges whined slightly, but the house did not wake up. I stepped onto the wet, cracked concrete of the driveway. The gravel crunched under my boots. The freezing air hit my face. I pulled the door shut behind me. Click. The house was empty to me now. If no one in that house would acknowledge my existence, I would knight myself. I would build my own empire in the dirt. I walked into the freezing fog, disappearing into the dark. I had $0 in my pocket and a one-way ticket to a war zone. But hell was a whole lot better than being a ghost in your own home. And I did survive. But exactly how I dragged myself out of that trench, that is a completely different kind of war. 13 years is a long time to live on a knife edge. I did not go to college frat parties. I did not buy $500 shoes on maxed-out credit cards. I spent my 20s eating chalky, vacuum-sealed rations in the back of cramped military transport planes. I slept on cracked concrete floors in the Middle East, where the temperature held steady at 110 degrees at midnight. The air always tasted like diesel exhaust and burning sand. Every time the enemy mortars hit the perimeter, the ground shook violently, rattling the fillings in my teeth. The heat baked into my skin. The dust coated my lungs. Mail call was a cruel joke. The other grunts gathered around the Humvees, tearing open care packages, letters, shitty baked goods from their mothers. I got nothing. Zero. Not a single piece of mail from Portland, Oregon. Not one text message. My parents never called. Talia never checked to see if I was dead or alive. To them, I was out of sight, out of mind. A low-level paper pusher. The family embarrassment hiding in a uniform. Let them think that. Every month, my combat pay hit my account. Hazard pay. Imminent danger pay. Separation allowance. I took every single bloody cent and shoved it straight into S&P 500 index funds. Vanguard, Fidelity. I drove a beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic with a grinding transmission. I bought plain clothes from discount store clearance racks. I bled, I sweat, I survived, and I compounded my interest. Fast forward to the present. Just a few days before the Palm Beach wedding disaster. Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base on the planet. I sat behind a massive elevated oak desk. The industrial air conditioning hummed constantly, freezing the sweat on the back of my neck. I wore the heavy black robe. I did not just push paper. I was a judge advocate general, a military judge. Commander Chloe Carter. A disgraced Navy captain stood on the floor in front of me. 2 decades of decorated service. He thought he was untouchable. He skimmed defense contracts to fund a sick gambling habit. Now he stood at rigid attention, his face ash-pale sweat beading on his forehead and dripping onto his perfectly pressed collar. I picked up my heavy steel fountain pen. The courtroom was dead silent. I did not yell. I did not give a self-righteous lecture about duty. You broke the oath, I said. My voice was flat. Cold rock hitting a steel floor. I signed my name at the bottom of the federal warrant. The sharp scratch of the metal nib echoed off the dark wood paneling. With one single stroke of ink, I stripped him of his command. I ended his federal pension. I sent him to Fort Leavenworth, maximum security for 5 hard years. The military police grabbed his arms. He dragged his feet across the polished floor. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind him. Thousands of lives. Billions in federal defense budgets. The stroke of my pen controlled it all. The family back in Portland thought I was fetching cheap coffee for petty officers. They had absolutely no idea they were related to a grim reaper in a black robe. The courtroom cleared out. I took off the heavy robe and draped it over the back of my leather chair. I sat alone at my desk. No entourage, no sycophants kissing the ring. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out a cheap plastic Tupperware container, leftover penny pasta and watery canned tomato sauce. I popped the lid off. The food was cold. I ate it anyway. The plastic fork scraped loudly against the bottom of the container. With my left hand, I unlocked my phone. I opened my banking application. Face ID scanned. The screen loaded in the dark room. I stared at the net worth total. 7 figures. A very heavy, very aggressive 7 figures. It was a number that would make Raymond Carter choke on his cheap bourbon. It was more liquid cash than Talia would ever see in her entire life, even if she married a dozen rich men. It was blood money turned into an ironclad financial empire. I did not feel the need to buy a Rolex. I did not need a European sports car. Real power does not need to scream for attention on social media. Real power eats cold pasta in silence and watches the interest accrue. I closed the app. The screen went black. Heavy combat boots hit the floor outside my office. The door clicked open. My bailiff walked in. He dropped a thick, red-banded manila folder right on the center of my desk. A classified routing sheet sat on top. "New orders, Commander," he said, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead. I pushed the plastic Tupperware aside. I broke the wax seal and flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. Department of Defense. A massive contractor fraud case. Millions of dollars missing from a naval shipyard budget. They needed a judge with a reputation for zero mercy. They needed a butcher to cut the fat. Location, Miami, Florida. I traced the word Miami with my scarred thumb. Miami. Just a 2-hour drive from Palm Beach, from Talia. From the high society wedding she had been threatening me to attend for the past 6 months. Flight leaves at 0600 tomorrow, the bailiff added. Understood, I said. He stepped out and closed the heavy door. I stacked the classified documents. I slid them into my steel-reinforced Halliburton briefcase. I snapped the heavy brass latches shut. The sharp metallic click echoed in the quiet room. 13 years I stayed in the shadows. I built my fortress out of dirt cordite and compound interest. Now the military was sending me down south, right into the backyard of the people who threw me away like garbage. I spun the combination lock on my briefcase. I grabbed the handle. I was heading to Miami. Miami. The Wilkie D. Ferguson Jr. United States Courthouse. The central air conditioning blasted through the massive federal building, freezing the sweat on the back of my neck. I stood at the podium in my service uniform. The fabric was stiff, sharp. The brass buttons caught the harsh fluorescent light overhead. A federal oversight committee sat elevated behind a massive mahogany bench. I was tearing down a multi-million-dollar defense contract fraud case, piece by piece. Cold, hard, undeniable facts. I did not use filler words. I did not hesitate. The room was dead silent. Nobody interrupted me. Right in the center chair sat Judge Stephen Reynolds, federal judge, former Navy surface warfare officer, an absolute powerhouse in the Southern District. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. He tapped his right index finger against his knuckles. A slow rhythmic beat. His eyes cut through the quiet room. Cold, gray steel. They locked onto my face. I saw the exact microsecond the recognition hit his brain. His tapping stopped. His jaw tightened. He did not say a word, but the shift in his posture was deafening. 10 years. It had been exactly 10 years since I dragged his political career out of a shallow grave. The memory hit me hard. A cramped, windowless bunker in D.C. I stayed awake for 48 hours straight. My eyes burned bloodshot and stinging as I combed through thousands of pages of encrypted naval logs. A shadow faction was trying to frame Reynolds. I found the discrepancy. I saved his badge. While I was surviving on burnt coffee and adrenaline fighting for a good man's life, my burner phone had buzzed against the metal desk. Vivian, my mother. She did not call to ask if I was sleeping. She did not call to see if the military was treating me right. I pressed the cheap plastic phone to my ear and she just started screaming. She was furious because I refused to wire $500 so Talia could buy a designer dress for a sorority reunion. You are so selfish, Chloe. Your sister needs to make connections, and you are hoarding your little government checks like a greedy rat. You are useless. That was my blood family, screaming about a piece of silk while I was holding the line for the Constitution. Recess for 15 minutes. The head of the committee barked, slamming a wooden gavel against a sounding block. Chairs scraped against the marble floor. I packed my classified files into my briefcase, slow, methodical. Footsteps approached from my left, heavy measured strides. Judge Reynolds walked down from the bench. He moved past the prosecutor's table. He walked right by me. He did not stop. He did not extend a hand for the cameras. He did not make a scene. But as his broad shoulder brushed past mine, his voice dropped to a low, gravelly whisper, only loud enough for me to hear. The truth always finds its way, Commander Carter. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes locked on my briefcase. I just gave a sharp, microscopic nod. That was it. The Lion's Code, no long speeches, no dramatic hugs. Just absolute, unwavering respect from a man who held the power to lock up billionaires. A man who respected me more than the people who shared my last name. I walked out of the courthouse and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The blinding Miami sun slammed into me. The humidity wrapped around my lungs like a wet towel. My encrypted phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. Admiral Hayes. I hit the green button. Sir. The committee just sent over the preliminary ruling. Hayes barked. His voice sounded like gravel grinding over broken glass, smelling faintly of cheap cigars even through the speaker. You gutted them, Carter. Flawless execution. Just doing the job, Admiral. The job here is done. Take 72 hours of liberty, he ordered. Go deal with your home front. Settle this wedding nonsense. And Carter... Yes, sir. Do not yield an inch to those people. I stood a little straighter on the sun-baked concrete. I never do, sir. The line clicked dead. A father figure. A real one. Someone who actually gave a damn whether I stood strong or crumbled. I walked 3 blocks to the train station. I bought a black bitter coffee from a street cart. I sat alone on a rusted metal bench watching the commuter rail cars idle on the tracks. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you earn. Then my personal phone rang, a shrill, obnoxious ringtone that cut through the heavy air. The screen lit up. Talia. I stared at the glowing letters, a toxic spill creeping back into my clean water. I swiped accept and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. You better be on your way, Talia snapped immediately. No greeting, just demands. The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow. If you show up late, you will completely humiliate me in front of Elliot's parents. Do not make me look like white trash just because you cannot afford a decent flight. I gripped the paper coffee cup. I squeezed. The hot liquid sloshed over the rim, spilling onto my knuckles. It burned. I did not flinch. I will be there, I said. Flat. Dead. Wear something that does not make you look like a grease monkey, she sneered. The line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone. I wiped the spilled coffee off my hand onto my dark trousers. A heavy Amtrak train blew its horn, the massive sound tearing violently through the humid evening air. The steel wheels shrieked against the tracks. I grabbed the handle of my Halliburton briefcase. The piece was over. I stepped onto the cold metal floor of the train car, heading straight for Palm Beach. I was walking right back into the minefield. The Florida sun was brutal. It glared off the hoods of 6-figure sports cars parked in the circular driveway, blinding and hot. The air was thick, heavy. The salty breeze from the Atlantic Ocean tried to push through, but it was completely choked out by the suffocating, sickly sweet stench of thousands of white orchids imported for the weekend. I stepped off the curb. My combat boots hit the hot asphalt with a heavy thud. I did not walk through the massive glass double doors of the luxury Palm Beach resort. I was not allowed to. Talia stood waiting for me by the side entrance, the service door, right next to the industrial kitchen exhaust fans blowing hot grease and bleach water into the alley. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a silk blouse that cost more than a standard military paycheck. She tapped her foot, annoyed. Her eyes tracked me as I walked up. She scanned my plain dark trousers, my heavy boots, my steel briefcase. Her upper lip curled in pure disgust. Go through this door, she snapped, pointing a manicured acrylic nail at the rusted metal frame behind her. I am not letting Elliot's family see your cheap grunt attitude dragging through the main lobby. I stopped. The heavy hum of the exhaust fan buzzed in my ears. I looked at the side door. Then I looked at her. Before I could speak, the metal door squealed open. Raymond and Vivian Carter stepped out into the alley. My parents, they looked ridiculous. Dad was sweating heavily through the stiff collar of a rented linen suit. He was rubbing his hands together, his eyes darting around the alley like he had just pulled off a bank heist. He was riding high on the fumes of someone else's wealth. This is it, Dad muttered, practically vibrating with nervous energy. He wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. The Reynolds family. This is a whole new level for us, Vivian. Real status. Nobody back in Portland is going to believe this. He completely ignored the fact that his youngest daughter was standing right in front of him, holding a briefcase packed with classified federal defense files. To him, I was just a prop, a nuisance. Mom adjusted her heavy pearl necklace. She shot me a hard, warning glare. Do not ruin this, Chloe, she ordered. Her voice was thin and sharp. We finally have a foot in the door with people who actually matter. Just blend in, know your place. I looked at the three of them, a family built entirely on a foundation of maxed-out credit cards, overdue car payments, and cheap illusions. They were playing dress-up in a world that would chew them up and spit them out the second the money ran dry. I tightened my grip on the handle of my briefcase. The metal dug into my calluses. I locked eyes with my father. Is status measured by the credit card debt you are hiding, Dad? I asked. My voice was dead flat, no anger, just a surgical strike. Or is it just measured by the lies you tell to get into the building? Raymond stopped rubbing his hands. His jaw dropped slightly. A dark, ugly flush of red crept up his thick neck, staining his cheeks. He opened his mouth to bark back, but nothing came out. The truth hit him right in the chest. He broke eye contact, swallowed hard, and looked away, pretending to check his knockoff watch. Talia stepped into my space. The heavy smell of her perfume hit the back of my throat. She reached into a high-end retail shopping bag resting on a dirty service cart. She pulled out a wad of fabric and shoved it hard against my chest. I caught it instinctively. It was a dress, ash gray, dull, lifeless. The kind of cheap, shapeless fabric you put on a mannequin you want people to completely ignore. "You wear this," Talia hissed, her face inches from mine. "I am the main character this weekend. You are nothing. You keep your mouth shut, you stand in the back corner of the room, and you do not speak unless spoken to. Do not try to steal my spotlight with your pathetic, depressing life." I stood perfectly still. The hot kitchen exhaust blew across my face. I looked down at the gray fabric in my hands. "Know your place. Stand in the corner. You are nothing." 13 years of biting my tongue. 13 years of shrinking myself down so this parasite of a sister could feel massive. I survived IED blasts in the desert. I survived commanding officers screaming in my face. I brought corrupt generals to their knees in federal court. And here I was standing in a grease-stained alley, letting civilian frauds treat me like a stray dog. My right hand squeezed the gray fabric. Hard. I squeezed until my knuckles turned stark white. The thick blue veins in my forearm bulged against my skin. The fabric stretched, the cheap seams popping under the sheer force of my grip. I did not yell. I did not throw the dress back in her face. I raised my eyes. I looked right through Talia's expensive sunglasses, straight into her insecure, hollow eyes. The safety lock in my head was completely gone. "I will wear it," I said quietly. The words sounded like a loaded gun sliding across a glass table. "I will see you on the balcony tonight, Talia. Just you and me." I shoved past her, my shoulder slamming hard into hers, and kicked the heavy service door open. The countdown had started. The pre-wedding party was a masterclass in aggressive fakeness. I stood outside on the private balcony, swallowed by the heavy Florida shadows. Through the thick, floor-to-ceiling glass sliding doors, I had a perfect tactical view of the room. Inside, the lighting was a warm, expensive amber. Waiters in crisp white shirts floated through the crowd carrying silver trays of caviar and champagne. Elliot, the groom, stood near the brass-trimmed bar. He looked exhausted. He kept rubbing the back of his neck while Talia hung off his arm, laughing a little too loud at a joke a state senator just told. Elliot was a decent guy. You could see it in his posture. He had a solid moral compass, but he was completely blind. He was buying the illusion. He thought he was marrying a sweet, sophisticated woman from a respectable, hard-working family. He was marrying a parasite. I leaned my hip against the cold stone railing. The Atlantic breeze whipped off the ocean, cutting through the humid air and whistling sharply through the cracks in the glass doors. I crossed my arms. The cheap gray fabric of the dress Talia forced me to wear scratched against my skin like fine sandpaper. I didn't care. The drab gray let me blend into the dark. It let me watch the enemy lines. The heavy glass door suddenly slid open on its metal tracks, with a dull, grinding scrape. Talia stepped out into the dark. She stumbled slightly, her designer high heel catching the metal lip of the door frame. She caught herself gripping the heavy brass door handle. In her other hand, a nearly empty martini glass tilted dangerously. The thick ice cubes smashed aggressively against the crystal. She kicked the door shut behind her. The loud bass of the party inside was instantly muted. She turned her head, her eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the dim light. They locked onto me, standing in the corner. "There you are." She slurred, her upper lip curling. She shoved off the door and took 2 unsteady steps toward me. The heavy smell of gin and expensive floral hairspray hit my face before she did. "You are always hiding," she spat. "Just lurking in the corners like some pathetic creep. It makes my skin crawl." I didn't move a muscle. I just kept my breathing slow. Even, 60 beats per minute. "You know exactly why you ran off to the military," Talia sneered, leaning in closer. Her eyes were glassy and unfocused, but the venom dripping from her words was pure. "Because you are a coward. You put on a stiff uniform so you could hide the fact that you are completely useless out here in the real world. You make me sick, Chloe. Your whole depressed, tragic act is just dragging my night down. It was a textbook move. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. She shoved me into a gray sack, banished me to the shadows so she could shine, and now I was the one ruining her night just by breathing the same air. 13 years of running away. 13 years of biting my tongue to keep the peace. It didn't buy me an ounce of respect. It just fed the monster. I uncrossed my arms. I let my hands drop to my sides. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. Talia actually flinched. Just a tiny, involuntary twitch in her left shoulder, but I saw it. I locked my eyes dead onto hers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream. When you know exactly where to slip the knife, you don't need to swing hard. I am not hiding, I said. My voice was a low, flat hum over the sound of the crashing waves below. I am observing. Talia swallowed hard, her knuckles turning white as her grip tightened on the stem of her glass. You don't hate me because I'm useless, Talia. I continued taking another slow step. I closed the distance until I was standing well inside her personal space. The temperature between us dropped to absolute zero. You hate me because you are terrified. You're crazy. She forced out a laugh, but it cracked right down the middle. You step on me. I said my words hitting her chest like hollow point rounds. Because you know exactly what happens if these people actually look at me. If they see what I have built in the dark. If they see who I really am, your little circus act is over. You will never be the center of the universe again. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The smug, arrogant mask on her face completely shattered. For a split second, the sheer naked panic bled through her eyes. I'd ripped the bandage off her deepest, darkest insecurity. Her jaw clenched tight. The panic twisted back into ugly, desperate rage. She raised her chin, trying to scrape together whatever fake authority she thought she had left. Tomorrow is my wedding, she hissed through her teeth. You better watch your back. You pull one stunt, you step out of line for 1 second, and I will destroy you. She spun around on her heel, nearly twisting her ankle on the concrete, and wrenched the sliding glass door open. She stormed back into the bright, loud room, leaving the door cracked behind her. If you have ever had to deal with a toxic family member who constantly gaslights you and plays the victim to cover up their own insecurities, you know exactly how exhausting this war is. Do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment the word "enough" down below. Let me know I am not the only one fighting this battle. I stood alone on the dark balcony. The wind picked up, whipping my hair across my face. I reached out and gripped the rough stone of the railing. I looked down at the tactical digital watch strapped to my wrist. 12 hours. The fuse was lit. The retreat was officially over. The hotel room was dead quiet. 6 in the morning. The only sound was the harsh hiss of hot steam spitting out of a cheap plastic iron. I stood over the ironing board. I pressed the heavy metal down on the drab gray dress Talia had thrown at me. Back and forth. Slow, deliberate strokes. I ironed exact razor-sharp creases into the cheap synthetic fabric. Muscle memory. The exact same way I prepped my combat uniform before a federal tribunal. The fabric smelled like burnt chemicals and cheap dye. I did not care. It was just armor. My encrypted phone sat flat on the edge of the board. The screen was illuminated in the dark room. I stared at the digital copy of the master guest list I had pulled from the hotel server. One name, printed in bold. Federal Judge Stephen Reynolds. I did not need a physical weapon tonight. I did not need to plan a screaming match in the middle of a ballroom. I did not need to raise my voice to defend my own honor. The detonator was walking through the front door at exactly 7 o'clock tonight. All I had to do was stand perfectly still and let the blast wave hit. 7:30 in the evening. The grand ballroom was a massive glittering circus of new money and desperate egos. The air inside was thick, suffocating. The heavy, sickening stench of butter-roasted lobster mixed with cheap cologne and spilled champagne. Hundreds of people packed into the room, their voices melting into a loud, obnoxious roar of fake laughter. The sharp clinking of silver forks scraping against expensive porcelain plates echoed off the high ceilings. I sat in the far back corner, right next to the swinging wooden doors of the service kitchen. Waiters bumped my chair every time they rushed past with heavy trays of dirty dishes. I did not move. My combat boots were planted flat on the floor beneath the hem of the gray dress. My spine was locked at a perfect 90-degree angle against the hard wooden chair. Shoulders squared, chin parallel to the ground, eyes scanning the perimeter. Pinned directly over my heart was the white plastic name tag. Chloe Carter, administrative clerk. Talia had slapped it on my chest an hour ago with a smug, satisfied smirk. People walked by my corner, rich housewives in tight silk dresses holding small dogs, arrogant men smoking expensive imported cigars. They looked at the drab gray dress. They read the cheap plastic tag. They snickered behind their hands, rolled their eyes, and kept walking. I let them look. I let them laugh. On a battlefield, you stand perfectly still in the trench to avoid catching a sniper bullet. In Palm Beach, you stand perfectly still to let the enemy empty their magazines before you return fire. Talia floated through the center of the room. She was holding a fresh glass of champagne surrounded by a group of older men in tailored suits. Two of them were state senators, heavy sweating men with fake tans and expensive gold watches tightly squeezing their wrists. Talia spotted me sitting in the corner. Her eyes lit up with malicious joy. A predator seeing a wounded animal tied to a post. She steered the group of politicians right toward my chair. She stopped right in front of me, blocking my view of the room. "And over here," Talia said, raising her voice just loud enough so the neighboring tables stopped talking and turned to listen. She pointed her champagne flute straight at my face. "This is my little sister, Chloe. She works in the Navy. You know, doing the grunt work down in the hot belly of the ships. Just a little desk clerk filling out forms. The pay is absolute pennies, but somebody has to do the dirty work. Right." A few guests at the nearby tables laughed out loud. The two senators chuckled, a wet, condescending sound from the back of their throats. One of them looked down at me, his eyes filled with pure, unfiltered pity. "Good for her," the senator muttered, swirling the amber whiskey in his crystal glass. "Keeps her off the streets, I suppose." I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I sat completely frozen in the chair. I analyzed my own pulse pressing against the veins in my neck. Steady, calm. Exactly 60 beats per minute. I was a ghost watching a room full of dead people playing with matches. Talia smiled, drinking up the attention and the laughter. She turned her back to me and led the politicians away, leaving me in the shadows by the kitchen doors. She thought she had won. She thought the public execution was over. She thought I was buried. Then the music stopped. The live string quartet in the center of the room abruptly ceased playing. The heavy gold-trimmed double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom violently swung open. The brass hinges groaned loudly in the sudden quiet. The crowd near the front immediately parted. They stepped back, clearing a wide path. Federal Judge Stephen Reynolds stepped into the room. He wore a tailored black tuxedo, but he moved like a battleship cutting through open water. His posture was rigid, imposing. The host of the party rushed forward, extending a hand to greet him. Reynolds ignored it. He did not shake hands. He did not smile. His sharp gray eyes swept across the massive ballroom. He was looking for someone. His gaze passed over the senators. It passed over Elliot. It passed over Talia, who was already fixing her hair and taking a step forward to introduce herself. Then, his eyes hit the dark corner by the kitchen doors. He stopped dead in his tracks. The entire room held its breath. The silence was absolute. Reynolds turned his body. His heavy leather dress shoes hit the marble floor. Clack, clack, clack. The sound echoed off the walls. He was not walking toward the bar. He was not walking toward the bride. He was walking straight toward the woman in the cheap gray dress. Judge Stephen Reynolds did not walk. He marched. Every step was a heavy, calculated strike against the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. The crowd of state senators, real estate developers, and trust fund heirs parted, immediately falling back like dead grass under a heavy combat boot. The suffocating smell of butter-roasted lobster and heavy imported perfume seemed to evaporate in seconds. The air in the room grew cold, replaced by the sterile, crushing pressure of a federal courtroom. He did not look at the bar. He did not look at the bride. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of my chair. The dark hidden corner by the swinging kitchen doors suddenly became the dead center of the room. Hundreds of eyes snapped toward the shadows. I stood up, slowly. I locked my knees. I kept my back perfectly straight. I looked past the cheap, shapeless gray fabric covering my chest. I looked past the white plastic badge that said Administrative Clerk. Reynolds did not look at the badge. He did not look at the ridiculous dress. He looked directly into my eyes. His jaw tightened. He snapped his heels together. The loud, sharp crack of leather hitting leather echoed violently off the high, gold-trimmed ceiling. He raised his right hand flat and tight, cutting a sharp angle to his brow. A perfect textbook military salute, right in the middle of a Palm Beach country club. The string quartet in the center of the ballroom completely stopped playing. The lead violinist lowered his bow, his mouth slightly open. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy, a total vacuum. Reynolds dropped the salute and extended his right hand, a gesture of absolute, unyielding respect among equals. "It is an absolute honor to see you again, Commander Carter," Reynolds said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the heavy, undeniable weight of federal authority. It cut through the silent room like a combat blade. I reached out. I gripped his hand. Firm, dry. The thick calluses on my thumb scraped against his palm. "The honor is mine, your honor," I said. My voice was completely flat. No gloating, no smile. Just two soldiers acknowledging the blood left in the dirt. Crash! The sudden sound of shattering crystal ripped through the dead silence. 10 feet away, Talia stood completely frozen. Her mouth was slightly open. The stem of her expensive champagne flute had slipped right through her manicured fingers. The heavy crystal shattered violently against the hard marble floor. Bright amber liquid splashed across the toes of her $500 heels and soaked deep into the edge of a priceless Persian rug. She did not even blink. Her eyes darted frantically between Reynolds and me. Her brain was misfiring desperately, trying to compute the impossible data standing right in front of her. The narcissistic collapse was happening in real time. Her carefully constructed reality was breaking apart piece by piece. "You," Talia stammered. Her voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic. She took a clumsy, uneven step forward. "You must be joking. You have the wrong person, Judge Reynolds. She is just a clerk. She does paperwork. She is nobody." Reynolds slowly turned his head. He looked at Talia. He did not see a blushing bride. He saw a civilian nuisance. His gray eyes turned to absolute ice. "I do not joke about military honor, young lady," Reynolds said. The words ground together like heavy granite stones. "And I certainly do not joke about the woman who single-handedly brought down a corrupt command to save the integrity of this country." He took a half step toward Talia. The sheer overwhelming force of his presence pushed her back. "She is not a clerk." Reynolds continued, his voice echoing in the dead quiet. "She is a judge advocate general, a supreme military judge. She holds the power to strip generals of their freedom. She is a sworn defender of the Constitution." Reynolds paused, letting the heavy silence choke her. "You should mind your tone when you speak to a superior officer." In the background, I heard a sharp, ragged gasp. I looked over the heads of the crowd. Raymond and Vivian Carter, my parents. Dad was gripping the edge of a high cocktail table so hard his knuckles were stark white. His face was the color of wet ash. The smug, self-satisfied grin he had worn all night was completely erased. Mom was trembling, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. They were staring at me like I was a heavily armed stranger who had just kicked down their front door. They traded me for cheap country club points, and they just realized they sold out a king. Talia could not handle it. The severe public humiliation. The complete destruction of her false narrative. The entire room full of state senators and elites staring at her like she was a delusional, lying fool. Her face twisted into an ugly, desperate mask of rage. She lost total control. She pointed a shaking acrylic nail straight at my face. "You lied to me," Talia screamed. The sound was shrill, echoing horribly off the crystal chandeliers. "You did this on purpose. You hid this just to ruin my weekend. You wanted to humiliate me." She was completely unhinged. The mask was gone. The monster was out in the open. I let go of the judge's hand. I stepped forward. 1 heavy step. 2. I closed the distance until my shadow fell completely over her trembling frame. I looked down at her. The cheap plastic name tag she forced me to wear was still pinned to my chest. It felt like a medal of absolute victory. I did not yell. I did not need to. I spoke in a low, dead whisper that carried straight into her throat, loud enough for the entire front row of guests to hear. I did not lie, I said. The words were heavy, cold iron hitting a concrete floor. You just never asked. 13 years, Talia. 13 years, and not a single one of you ever asked me a single question. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as the truth finally buried her. I turned my back to her, leaving her standing in the puddle of broken glass. The air in the ballroom turned toxic, heavy. It tasted like sour wine, cheap hairspray, and raw panic. Elliot stared at the woman he was supposed to marry in 12 hours. The warm, expensive amber lighting caught the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He looked physically ill, like he had just swallowed ground glass. He did not yell. He did not throw his hands up. He just looked completely hollowed out, staring at the monster hiding inside the silk gown. You used your own blood as a prop, Elliot said. His voice was steady, but it shook the foundation of the room. You dragged her through the dirt just to make yourself look taller. Talia scrambled on the wet marble floor. The spilled champagne soaked into her designer dress, staining it dark yellow. She reached out her acrylic nails, clawing at his pant leg. Elliot, wait. She set me up, she is crazy. Elliot set his heavy crystal glass down on a nearby cocktail table. Clink. This wedding is cancelled, he said. He did not hesitate. He pulled his leg away from her grip. I am done. He turned his back. He walked into the crowd. He did not look back. Talia's knees gave out completely. She hit the hard floor with an ugly, heavy thud. She started sobbing. It was not a sad cry. It was a loud, shrill, desperate shriek. The sound of a parasite that just lost its host. The narcissistic collapse was absolute. Nobody rushed to help her up. The state senators, the wealthy developers, the high society housewives, they all just backed away. Disgusted, treating her like a contagious disease. Then came the shuffling of shoes. A desperate dragging sound against the polished stone floor. Vivian pushed her way to the front. My mother. Her expensive foundation was smeared under her eyes. She smelled like heavy gin and sheer terror. She reached her hands out toward me. Her fingers were trembling violently. Chloe, she whimpered. Her voice was a wet, jagged whisper. She tried to grab my arm. Chloe, if you had just told us the truth, we could have been so proud of you. I looked down at her shaking hands. Proud. The words scraped against my eardrums like rusted metal on concrete. It was the ultimate insult. A final, unforgivable betrayal. I did not step back. I swung my left arm up and slapped her hands away. It was a sharp, violent smack that echoed over Talia's crying. Vivian gasped, pulling her hands to her chest like she had just touched a burning stove. You are not proud of me, I said. The words were dead. Cold, a surgical strike to the chest. You are proud of a rank. You are proud of a title you can brag about at your pathetic country club dinners. You never gave a damn about the blood it took to earn it. Raymond stepped up next to her. His face was flushed deep red. The thick veins in his neck bulged against his tight rented collar. He pointed a thick finger at me. Now you listen here, Chloe. You do not speak to your mother. You will shut your mouth. Judge Reynolds did not shout. He just dropped the words like a 1,000-pound concrete slab. Raymond choked on his own breath. He took a fast, clumsy step backward, completely terrified of the man standing beside me. You do not get to claim her victories today, Reynolds said. His gray eyes drilled a hole straight through my father's skull. You left her to sleep in the dirt. You treated a decorated federal officer like garbage. You people sicken me. Raymond opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked down at the floor, the ultimate coward completely stripped of his fake armor. The psychological slaughter was over. The room was a graveyard of their own making. I looked at the three of them. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I just felt completely, totally empty. It was a clean, sterile void. The infection was finally burned out. I turned my body to face the judge. I locked my spine. I snapped my heavy boots together. The sharp crack of leather cut through the room, silencing the remaining whispers. "This area is no longer secure, Your Honor," I said. My voice was strictly operational, flat and professional. "Permission to withdraw." Reynolds looked at me. The hard iron lines around his mouth softened for a fraction of a second. He gave a single, slow nod. "Granted, Commander," he said softly. "Dismissed." I executed a sharp about-face. I faced the crowd. They parted instantly. Hundreds of high society elites scrambled backward, knocking into tables and chairs to get out of my path. They looked at me like I was carrying a live grenade. I walked down the center of the massive ballroom. I did not look back at Talia, crying in the broken glass. I did not look at my parents standing in the smoking wreckage of their fake empire. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead. I pushed the heavy brass handles of the front doors. They swung open, hitting the outside walls with a loud thud. I stepped out into the dark. The thick, salty air of the Atlantic Ocean hit my face. It was rough. It smelled like brine and heavy rain. I stopped by a heavy iron trash can near the valet stand. I reached up to my chest. I unpinned the cheap white plastic tag from the gray dress. I held it over the dark opening. I let it go. It hit the bottom of the empty metal bin with a hollow rattle. I turned toward the dark street, swallowed by the roar of the ocean waves, and never looked back. 1 week later, Naval Station, Norfolk. The rain came down in thick, heavy sheets. It slammed violently against the reinforced glass of my office window, blurring the massive gray warships docked in the harbor. The room smelled like damp wool, black ink, and cheap brass polish. I sat behind a massive oak desk. My spine was perfectly straight. My uniform was pressed flat. Everything in the room had a purpose. Everything was in its exact place. The heavy wooden door clicked open. Talia stood in the doorway. She was completely unrecognizable. The designer silk and the arrogant smirk were gone. She wore a cheap soaked raincoat. Her blonde hair hung in wet, heavy clumps across her face. Her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks, sinking into the deep lines around her mouth. She looked exactly like what she was. Empty. Defeated. She stepped into the office. Her eyes darted around nervously. She looked at the heavy brass plaques bolted to the wall, the rows of framed military commendations, the heavy fabric of the American flag standing perfectly still in the corner. She saw the absolute, undeniable weight of real power. It crushed her. Her knees wobbled. She grabbed the edge of a leather guest chair to keep from hitting the floor. "Chloe," she choked out, a pathetic wet sound. "I lost everything. Elliot is gone. His family blacklisted us from the club. Mom and Dad will not even look at me anymore. I have absolutely nothing." She started sobbing, loud, ugly gasps echoing in the quiet room. She was expecting me to rush over, expecting me to fix it, expecting the old dynamic where she cried and I took the blame. I did not look up. I picked up a matte black fountain pen. I flipped open a classified personnel file. I signed my name at the bottom of the page. The sharp scratch of the metal nib against the thick paper was the only sound in the room, cutting right through her fake tears. I placed the pen down. Click. I finally looked at her. Dead center. "Do not patch up rot with lies," I said. My voice was a flat, cold line of steel. "Go find your actual worth." Talia stared at me. The finality of the words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The manipulation failed. The victim card was declined. I was not her punching bag anymore. I was a wall of concrete she just crashed into. She lowered her head, turned around, and dragged her wet boots out of the office. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. 6 months passed. October. The brutal summer heat was replaced by the sharp, biting wind of the Atlantic coast. I sat at my kitchen counter, running a heavy whetstone over the steel blade of my combat knife. Shh, shh. Slow, measured strokes. The house was dead quiet. My phone buzzed against the granite counter. The vibration rattled loudly. Incoming call, Vivian Carter. I wiped the blade clean with an oily rag. I tapped the speaker button. "Chloe." My mother's voice chirped through the speaker. It was loud, too loud. A forced, desperate kind of bright. In the background, I heard the faint clinking of ice in crystal glasses, the low murmur of polite, wealthy conversation. The country club. I am busy, I said. Oh, it will just take a second. She rushed out, her voice pitching up specifically for the audience sitting around her. I'm sitting here with the girls from the golf committee. We just saw the Navy Times article about your promotion to the Pentagon. Sweetheart, I just had to call and tell everyone how incredibly proud we are of you. You are our shining star. I stopped wiping the blade. I stared down at the glowing phone screen. 13 years. I bled in the sand. I sat alone in dark rooms. I fought federal corruption. I earned every single stripe on my shoulder. Never a single phone call. Not one. Now she needed a trophy to show off to a bunch of bored housewives with fake tans. I leaned down over the speaker. Call me back, I said, my voice dropping an octave cold enough to freeze the ice in her glass. When your pride does not need an audience of strangers to exist. I reached out and hit the red button. Beep. The connection died. The boundary was set. A permanent wall of solid iron. My screen lit up again. A text message. Elliot, thank you. 2 words. An acknowledgement that I saved him from stepping on a landmine. I stared at the screen for 2 seconds. I did not type a reply. I did not send a polite emoji. I swiped left. Delete. I walked over to the kitchen window. I held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. No sugar, no milk, just bitter boiling heat. I took a slow drink, letting it burn the back of my throat. Outside, the autumn wind whipped violently across the naval yard. The heavy fabric of the American flag snapped against the tall steel pole. A sharp, aggressive sound cutting through the morning air. Down below on the wet asphalt, a fresh platoon of recruits marched past. Their heavy boots slammed into the ground in perfect unison. A solid, unstoppable machine. A drill instructor marched alongside them, his voice raw and booming, echoing off the concrete barracks. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm vibrated against the glass. It vibrated deep in my chest. For 13 years, I crouched in a dark, suffocating bunker, waiting for the artillery shells of my own family to stop dropping. I hid in the shadows just to keep them comfortable. Not anymore. I took another slow sip of the black coffee. I looked out over the massive gray hulls of the warships docked in the harbor. I owned the high ground now. The war was officially over. The absolute deafening silence in my mind was the sound of true victory. I set the mug down. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.